special broadcast coming to you live from the city of Durban, where the 27th session of the World Economic Forum on Africa is currently in session. I'm Gugulethu Cele, and today we join you for a phenomenal conversation regarding blended finance, an innovative financing tool which has been regarded as a disruptor within the financial services industry with regard to its complementary use of making use of grant loans as well as the mixture of non-grant capital available in order to attain the development needs and objectives that we have on the African continent, all whilst meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Is it sufficient? Are we seeing the rollout of blended finance instruments taking place on the African continent? And more importantly, how does it fit in with ensuring that we meet our SDG objectives and ensuring that efficient development takes place while keeping with the theme of financial inclusion for all? Well, that's what we aim to unpack over the next hour with my esteemed panelists and audience members who will be participating in a Q&A session later in the show. But let me introduce you to my panelists, starting to my right, Mr. Jeffrey Qhena, who's the Chief Executive Officer and President of the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. Followed by Thierry Deu, who's the CEO of Meridium Infrastructure. Patrick Dlamini, CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mamadou Pete, MD of Rockefeller Foundation Africa. And last but not least, our female on the end, Nena Stojilkovic, who is a Vice President of Blended Finance and Partnerships at the IFC. You too can participate in conversation with us on social media. Be sure to use the hashtag WEF on CNBCA, that's WEF on CNBCA, and hashtag DBSA_WEF. Well, let's continue to get into the conversation and really unpack what has been highlighted as a phenomenal engineering with regard to financial instruments, barring the controversy though, but getting an understanding of how all participants can really move forward in participating by unleashing capital to meet development objectives. Nena, I'd like to start with you. There is a solid understanding of blended finance here in the room, but for the benefit of audience members and those who might be keen to unpack this topic more, give us an overview with regard to blended finance, how it's worked in the past through the IFC, and implementation strategies that are currently taking place on the continent.
Thank you and good morning. As you know, IFC has been using blended finance instruments for about 10 years, but in a very disciplined way, while most of our financing to emerging markets has been through commercial instruments. And of course, we always prefer commercial, market-based instruments wherever and whenever possible. But you mentioned SDGs and the huge needs for financing and investments in Africa. We are talking about trillions of dollars, and the only way to provide that financing is to engage the private sector. They will be the ones who will be bringing trillions because those funds do not exist in the public sector. We therefore started using blended finance to move the private sector players into the markets that are not fully efficient, and to remove some of the negative externalities that those pioneers, if I may call them, experience as they go into those markets. So we use blended finance when there is a first of its kind project, just to improve the risk return profile and at the same time make an impact on the ground. What we have also found through our experience is that the blended finance has to be minimal, as minimal as possible, to unlock and maximize private sector participation. IFC will always invest along the blended finance instrument. And I also want to say that minimality doesn't just come from the amount of this de-risking blended finance part. It also comes from the type of instruments. You can obviously build in concessionality upfront by providing a low interest rate loan, but you can also build it exposed. If things do not happen as expected, you can have guarantees or some of the other exposed instruments like first loss that would then kick in, but not be embedded just up front. So minimality comes from the amounts, from the type of instruments. It also comes from the temporary nature of what we want to achieve through blended finance. When we invested, for example, in some of the first renewable energy projects in Africa, we used blended finance instruments. But now in several countries, blending is not needed anymore. The markets have opened up. The sector reforms have taken place, and now we are actually financing those projects on fully commercial terms. And maybe the last thing that I would like to say in this initial framing is that as many of us are using blended finance, and as it still means different things to many people, we in IFC are working with other multilateral development institutions to come up with common principles for blended finance, because the idea is not to distort the market, and that's maybe the controversy that you were referring to, but to actually open up market and maximize the mobilization of the private sector.
Opening up the market, and as you've alluded to, getting increased participation from all members there, so that blended finance perhaps is not seeked as an option going forward. Patrick, I'd like to come to you to get your views regarding the status quo of blended finance, not only within the Southern African fraternity, but continentally overall. And Thierry, I'd like you to add your commentary there too.
Oh, thanks. I think blended finance is going to be quite a critical instrument of actually credit enhancing what otherwise would be an impossible to fund projects across the continent. We still have a huge gap in terms of infrastructure funding, and therefore working with philanthropic organizations and working with multilateral organizations and national DFIs is going to be extremely important. First in terms of the early stage project prep, as well as making sure that the participation of the private sector becomes possible, because it's all about us trying to say, how do we make these projects fundable in a manner that is sustainable? Because blended financing with actually grants coming in, concessionary funding coming in, risk capital coming in, long-dated financing and guarantees coming in, it really then start making difficult projects very possible. And as we are also driving the SDGs and also working with WEF on the Sustainable Development Investment Partnerships, where we have about 34 partners, what we are trying to achieve, we are hosting the SDGs Africa actually jointly with IDC, with my colleagues Jeff Kirner here. And again, what we're trying to achieve is also to say, how do we work with so many players and actors across the globe, wherein we are able actually to access the skill sets, wherein we're able to access various financial instruments that will be able to make the progress and traction of big and transnational projects across the continent viable. So it's extremely strategic and important that we really leverage and dip into blended financing to make this possible.
Thierry?
And from the private sector perspective, I think the way we see blended finance is quite fundamental, actually. It is about de-risking the opportunity for the private sector and slicing the risk in a way that the private sector can actually come in, intervene, and be efficient. So it's really a great instrument, and there's no sort of magic wand about blended finance. Everything is bespoke, because you really have to go into every specific project and target the risks that are difficult for the private sector to take, and then use the instruments, whether grants, whether guarantees, whether concessional loans, to actually help the private sector move in. So, I mean, our recent blended finance experience was only 6 months ago in Turkey, where we were able to raise a green bond, so really tagging to what Patrick was saying about sustainable development goals for a hospital in Turkey, raising 20-year money with the help of MIGA and EBRD, and also IFC was present in that project through the use of guarantees and political risk insurance from MIGA. And it's really minimizing the amount mobilized by the MDBs and the DFIs, but maximizing the amount mobilized by the private sector.
Mm-hmm. There are several themes that I want us to piggyback off of at the moment. And the first theme that I'd like us to identify is that from an IFC perspective, Nena, you did allude to the fact that you align your vision and objectives with that of the donor. The private sector, as you've alluded to, Thierry, obviously wants to see at least a significant amount of risk be mitigated from the investment there. So picking up on themes regarding the leverage that needs to be attained, impact from these investment structures, and of course, risk-adjusted return. Which is needed by the private sector. I'd like to get some perspective from representative of DFIs as well as from donor organizations, and even an open commentary from the panel with regard to how do we ensure that the objectives and the roles of all stakeholders are carefully taken care of here, because it can become quite a minefield to negotiate when it comes to sourcing and putting together these blended finance instruments. Jeffrey, let's start with you.
Thanks for the opportunity. If I respond directly to your question, I think it is important as when you start and you identify the partners, that it's clear who plays what role. Ourselves as development finance institutions is to leverage, is to start new projects, is to go to territories which are not chartered. So when you do that, the risk at some of those are very early stage, is very high. But when you look at, particularly in infrastructure-related type of projects, those are big-ticket items. So on your own, you can't do that. So it's just logical that you need other players. But now, as you know, the different mandates, particularly for private sector, where some of them, the appetite for early risk will not be there, but they would be able to have big checks. So you clarify who plays what role. So it is important. And I think, as it's been said by some of the panelists, the whole idea is not to try, it's to stretch what you're putting in. So if you're de-risking, try and put in what is adequate so that then you can be able to unlock a number of other projects. So for us, is how do you do that? You have to clarify so that the roles are clear. And also so that you can be able to manage the return expectations.
Is that always easy in the early stages of negotiation?
If it's clear who plays what role, because then private sector would come up with their requirements in terms of the return expectations, because some of them, that money would have been either invested by players or that money comes up with its strings. So, but because we want to extend the reach, so it will be clear. So I wouldn't say, I mean, it would be as easy as that, but it must be clear to say, okay, here's the donors that are playing that role, and here's the development finance institutions like ourselves, but also ourselves as IDC, the same as IFC, would also play the role on the long-term finance as well. So we would do that. So that in a way gives us a good sense. But also what we want to do as IDC, and in fact, I'd like to believe in all the DFIs, is to be able to invest in a number of projects. So if you are able then to leverage at the back of that, then that gives one a very good opportunity.
Mamadou, I'd like to get your commentary here too.
Well, let me first say that for a foundation philanthropic organization like ours, who has the ambition of driving inclusivity and produce development outcomes, we recognize that our resources are very limited, and we need to approach this from really bringing commercially viable solutions, because this is really the way to sustain these outcomes, but also to scale them. And that we can do only by bringing the private sector. But we see also that we have maybe an advantage that over the private sector, or maybe even public, by being able to actually provide what we call the risk capital, go where actually private sector cannot go, and develop or open up that market for them to come. And but it's really what is very most important is really the development outcomes that we are going to. So for us, we use a combination of instruments, which are grants, concessional financing, and guarantees as well. And it is also very important that actually from the beginning, the outcomes that we are committed to are clear. What would be the role of each, and for how long we de-risking, and what is the potential, actually, additional investment this is supposed to leverage, and the conditions in which that is made available are really important. And I think that this is really the kind of things that needs to be clear up front to really drive a mutually advantageous relationship, but more importantly, that really provides those outcomes that we are looking for the population or for the countries, etc., in fine. So it's been actually, we've had a number of examples in the health sector, in the energy sector, and currently in Africa also in the agricultural sector as well, where we're providing those type of instruments to really bring in the private sector to invest, for instance, in agricultural processing or providing loans to smallholder farmers in a sector that is seen as being a very risky sector in Africa, and also maybe smallholder farmers not being credit-worthy, actually clients, and who find it very difficult to access the financing they need. And providing those guarantees have really helped, for instance, some banks being able to see those smallholder farmers as a potential market, but also viable clients with which they can develop new financing instruments, etc., which enables them to be more productive.
Exactly. So this is just one part of a bigger goal and objective that we're hoping to achieve. Thierry, you had a comment too?
I just wanted to make something clear, is that private sector actually doesn't want the project to be totally without risk, because we actually need to make returns. So it's so we do need to retain some risk. So it's really about slicing the risks that are very, very difficult to keep. We have to remember that these infrastructure projects are large scale, very long, so you're talking 20, 30 years, and therefore in certain countries it's a huge commitment. So you need the sort of support that may go away as the country develops, as the counterparty becomes a better credit. But it's quite important to be able to go through that transition, and that is what the private sector is seeking, not to totally have risk disappear, otherwise there will be no return. So you have to be very clear about that. The other point that I would make is there's also no ambiguity about achieving the goals at the outset. I think we all have, with all the MDBs and DFIs, pretty good standards about tackling social impact, environmental impact, carbon footprint. And it's fairly widely shared and mostly standardized from the IFC standards, from your standards. They're very similar. And in fact, the discussion happens practically at the beginning before each project in terms of what we're trying to achieve, what are the standards we're going to be following, what are the key performance indicators for these standards that we will try to reach, and monitor them throughout the project life. So there's no possibility to get away with murder in a way by using blended finance, because there's a discipline around that financing.
You bring up two important themes there that I'd like us to explore and maybe piggyback off, because you do mention risk, and I want us to talk about risk in Africa in the now. It's the environment is quite disruptive and noisy, as we know. We do see some of the top performing economies going through difficult economic growth, if not in recession, rather flat economic growth. We also have witnessed some downgrades taking place on the largest economies. So risk is clearly there. So perhaps feeding again the appetite of the private sector, even though it does want to see it being leveraged. You did also mention discipline. So if we take a look at these African economies, many of which are classified as emerging or frontier markets, risk is there. Does it mean that blended finance needs to be the top option? And most importantly, how do we implement these blended finance instruments with the discipline that you've alluded to? Patrick, let's start with you and open the way for the panel.
I think it's quite interesting that you're mentioning the issue of risk, because there is perceived risk and there's a real risk. The African continent has a challenge of heightened risk perception which then says the fair risk-adjusted returns are not necessarily the true reflection of the real risk. So it becomes very important then that we then begin also to ensure that as long as on the political side there's stability, because the economic and financial crisis actually that we've seen since 2007 has made it so much difficult for many governments across the continent where their central fiscus was dependent on commodities and revenues from commodities. So all of a sudden, now the central fiscus can't back or backstop any of the projects which might be critical for the country. So blended financing then coming in there and crystallization of the risk so that we make sure that the risk premium that is levied on the project is a fair one. But I think it's a function of political stability, it's a function of the expertise in how you structure these projects in a manner that its economics then are well crystallized and becomes quite attractive for the private sector to come in. But again, look at the negative interest rate countries across the world. I mean, it is said that there's almost like 8.5 trillion US dollars that actually is subject to negative interest rate. So if we could be innovative and smart enough in leveraging on this blended financing on the African continent, you can imagine how much actually interest we could be able to attract when people can say that they, all of a sudden, instead of me paying my bank for keeping my money, I can invest it on the continent. And I would be guaranteed that actually I would be getting double-digit returns. So it's a very fascinating, innovative way actually of really making sure that we're able to then put these trillions onto well-deserved investment areas, because SDGs and Agenda 2063 talks about a huge requirement and investment that actually has got to be seen into making many projects across the continent possible.
I understand we need 4.5 trillion US dollars in order to cover all the development goals as we head up to 2030.
Per year.
Exactly. You wanted to touch on the discipline element.
Yes, I also wanted to say that development banks are actually created to deal with imperfect markets, with crisis situations, with countries in turmoil. And it's not a coincidence that our priority right now for IFC, for the World Bank Group, is to develop Africa. And that's why we're shifting our strategy to innovate around instruments, including scale-up blended finance. But I also wanted to say that blended finance is not a solution to every risk that's out there. I look at risk as a financial risk, and I think we touched on some of them, and that's where de-risking instruments, blended finance instruments can help. But there is also a non-financial risk that has to be addressed through some other ways. I mean, it's a lot of advisory services, building capacity of the governments to implement, for example, PPP projects, building capacity of clients also to deal with environmental and social issues that Thierry mentioned, to deal with skills, with training. And we are not doing blended finance alone. We, IFC, and many others are actually having support for those other issues that a company may face on the ground here in Africa, so that we can build their capacity to be successful. I also want to say that only commercially viable project will ultimately be successful, will generate sustainable jobs. And that's why I was very happy to hear from Mamadou that even as a foundation, they're looking for commercial solutions. Because to me and to us, grant is the last resort. If you have to pay money back, you're actually disciplined with your costs, you are trying to look at your revenues, you're trying to actually make things happen. So I really also wanted to refer to limited grants. Grants are provided by the donors and foundations, but as you know, it's around maybe $130 billion per year of ODA, and you know, if everything goes in as grants, we will lose the opportunity to make some reflows and reinvest them. And so the idea is to use 130 billion of ODA every year to maximize mobilization and bring trillions through private sector. So there is a very ambitious objective, but if we resort to grant immediately, we will not be thinking about these other instruments and other solutions that can create that multiplier effect.
Now, when we look at, you mentioned the downgrades. So the downgrades in themselves come with where now the traditional or the normal other types of funding would not necessarily be there, or if it's there, it becomes very expensive. So for me, the opportunity that blended finance brings is to say where there are projects, because the fact that the country is downgraded does not necessarily mean suddenly there are no bankable projects.
True.
It's how that risk then has to be mitigated. So for me, that brings that opportunity to say then, how do we use this type of instrument to say those projects that are bankable, if they are structured well, those projects that will have much more development impact that can unlock that. And that's what I would like to believe. Because as we know, the African continent is not trading with itself to a large extent. And one of the reasons is because of lack of infrastructure and energy. And if we use some of the blended finance opportunities to be able to unlock that, maybe some of those shocks that we've experienced as an African continent, which is very young, by the way, which has got lots of opportunities, then those can be unlocked. And I'd like to believe in a very ironic way, where some of these major countries, South Africa and Nigeria, have been downgraded and they can play a role. Now then they can be able to have access to other alternative forms of financing, blended, so that then we can unlock those. I think what Patrick has said is the policies have to be there, I think, because all funders, regardless of whether we're development finance institutions, donors, whatever, I think the policies need to be there, and it should be clear to all the funders that those are consistent, those are implementable. So once we've taken that aside, then we can be able to look and unlock some of those projects so that employment can be created at the back of that as well.
Exactly, and the end goal with regard to the SDGs are attained. Given the two comments that we've just received from both Nena and yourself, Jeffrey, does it mean that now, given the macroeconomic turmoil environment, that blended finance is the way to go for major projects across the African continent, but still bearing in mind the discipline element that needs to be brought about?
Yeah, well, it's important for the discipline to be there. We shouldn't say, I think, as
how do you instill that, and how do you ensure that there's accountability?
Well, when you structure the projects, I think it's important that they have the ability to be commercially sustainable. Because if we're going to try and use blended finance as a silver bullet, even on projects that are not commercially sustainable, whatever objectives that we want it to be it employment creation, be it regional integration, that will fall flat. So it is important right at the beginning to ensure that that environment is there, so that you indeed can ensure that what you're trying to fund is sustainable going forward. Particularly, as has been said, I mean, because some of these are long-term projects. I mean, if you're going to put in money on a 20-year project, you better be absolutely sure that there is potential for that project to be sustainable.
Mama, do you want to add commentary?
Yes, I wanted to add a comment because I believe that blended finance is probably not most effective just to enable private sector, to make investments, reducing the risk. But it is really more effective when it is deployed in new frontiers. Yeah. And I think that this is really new areas of potential commercial activity that I think Nina said this first of its kind to unlock that. But it's not necessarily for just the imperfections in a particular market. It could help, but probably not the most and preferred. But it's really where we can really bring a breakthrough, additionality in the market, and new opportunities. And this is where I find that these instruments can be really as an instrument of that enables progress and going much more forward. So I think that is the appropriate.
Okay. I mean, I can understand from the foundation perspective that could be your focus, but scalability is also important. So if this instrument can be used to do more of some of these projects, even in countries where only some imperfections are there, it's great, because at the end of the day, what really counts is the impact on the communities. And if you can bring power to 1 million more people in a country that already more or less function through blended finance, then let's do it. Let's not necessarily always try to go to the frontier. We can do both. There's no exclusion from one for the other, but it's quite important to actually do this focus. I mean, we, on our own sort of small foundation that we have, we always mix a little bit of our own foundation money with our project money. And it's very important, we're talking about risk, to engage with the communities around this investment, to really make sure that there is a good understanding and a good leverage of investment that you make into the communities in terms of, certainly job creations just don't happen because you're going to be investing tons of money in one particular place. It takes engagement, it takes training, it takes going to talk to the uneducated or untrained youth and bring them into the jobs, and that is clearly done with some foundation money that we put ourselves. So, and to me, that's a huge mitigator of long-term risk when you engage with communities. I mean, the big elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned is political risk, because that most investors are mostly obsessed with that. But political risk is a manifestation of communities being not satisfied or unhappy with some of the investment that are being made. So if you engage with them on the long term through this instrument, that actually brings more discipline, to be honest with you, than the normal concessional grants. So I don't know why there is a controversy about it, because I think there's more discipline in blended finance that has been in normal public lending generally, because the parties around make it more disciplined, because there are many people accountable from the private sector who are not always there to grab all the money, but actually there to invest in something that is sustainable. With the DFIs, with the government sides, with the communities. So you have all the stakeholders that are in something that is quite new, where everyone has a little piece, and that discipline is actually much higher than, you know, the World Bank giving a big loan to a country for its budget on roads or hospitals, because you never really know where the money goes.
And ensuring accountability. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I do see that there's some responses that your colleagues do want to provide, but we are under pressure for a quick ad break. When we do return, though, we continue with the theme regarding blended finance, accountability, no doubt, and of course getting some questions from our audience. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. You're still joining us here for our conversation on blended finance, coming to you from the sidelines of the World Economic Forum on Africa. Now, just before the break, we had touched on several themes: the implementation of blended finance on the continent, the discipline that needs to be exercised, and Thierry very strongly saying that because of the enhanced levels of accountability, given the multi-stakeholder views, there's good progress with regard to blended finance. But Nana, you wanted to respond to that very briefly.
Yes, I can understand Thierry's perspective, but even when you look at us on this panel, we could all be offering Thierry different level of concessionality for his project, and of course he would go probably for a grant rather than for a lower priced loan or some exposed guarantee instrument. I can understand that perspective, or from our perspective, we want to maximize, as I said, the ODA, maximize the reflows, maximize the potential for commercial viability and ultimate opening of the markets. And there are several ways how we will work on this discipline. One is obviously having clear principles that all of us will adopt as we finance certain types of projects in certain types of sectors. The second one is transparency. Reporting, because the money comes from the donors and governments, basically, who are putting these funds into overseas development assistance. So we want to report on levels of concessionality, and that will bring transparency, and we can pinpoint institutions or people who are not doing it the right way, and ultimately donors, because they want to maximize the reflows over time, given the scarcity of the ODA, will actually be giving this blended finance ability to those who actually use it in a disciplined way. So there is a circle there that I think will be very beneficial also for the private sector participants.
Mm-hmm. Terry, you agreeing there?
No, I mean, I agree. It is a discipline that needs to come actually from the DFI itself.
Yes, yes.
And I really welcome the new cascade principles announced by Jim King earlier this year, and all the principles of additionality that the DFI has used. But it is true that they do need to sort of agree on what those principles are and what the priorities are. And the priority is minimizing the grant system and leveraging as much as possible and having money that comes back. And I think if that was very clear for the past 20 years, we would have made a lot more progress. But that's a policy issue at the MDB's level.
Yes, and we're working on it.
Before we do get to the questions, Patrick, you had some feedback that you wanted to provide.
Yeah, no, I think we're not saying that we need to try actually and come and distort the pricing of projects. Because if we were to do that, I think we will not actually be doing justice to the project themselves. But the issue here is the bankable projects. It is the lack of bankable projects in the market. There is so much funding available out there, but projects are not well structured in such a way that actually the investors are comfortable in coming in, or the risk haven't been crystallized well enough for the private sector to come in. So the early stage project prep is extremely, extremely important. And the skill set also that goes with it is very important. And then the long end is the patient capital. That we need to find some innovative ways of attracting the pension funds into the continent. Many pension funds across the globe were limited by regulations that they could not expose a certain number or a certain percentage or more than 5%. Now we're seeing an increasing easing of that regulation into now up to 10% of the pension fund could be released. So that then says if we were innovative and smart enough, there is so much that we can unlock.
Exactly. I love how the conversations are unfolding here, perhaps giving us insight into what actually takes place in the boardrooms, excuse me. But let's start off with the questions, and we'll start off with you, sir, in the front with your question. If you could kindly introduce yourself and pose your question to the panel, and we'll follow through with you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Andre Kruger. I'm from the NEPAD Business Foundation. And I think I just wanted to touch on the issue that Patrick just mentioned on the skill set. So my question is to the panel, just to spend a little bit more time on the use of blended finance within the PPP environment. We find more and more governments in Africa making use of the public-private partnership model. My specific interest in that is also because of the accreditation of the NEPAD Business Foundation as an accredited training provider for the World Bank initiated certified PPP professional program. And we also teach blended finance when dealing with state-owned companies, municipalities in this process. So if the panel would care just to spend a little bit more time of the use of blended finance in the PPP model. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your question, Andre. You can go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. My question is on innovation, the future industries, basically. We mention risk a lot, that blended finance will assist with the de-risking some of the projects. And I just want to find out, especially from the DFIs, that what's the balance, or how do you strike the balance between investing in infrastructure, which is basically the foundation, and at the same time investing in the innovative industries of the future to ensure that our economic growth actually leapfrogs, that we don't crawl to the future effectively, because we know we're already behind as Africa. How do we actually catch up and actually make sure that we are, our future state of our economy, or of our continent rather, is that of a developed economy, because we've been developing forever and a day, so we do need to invest more in the innovative industries. So how do you strike that balance between what is needed now, the infrastructure, and the future industries?
Very true. Thank you so much for both those questions. Jeff, you want to respond?
Let me respond to the last question. In fact, at the IDC, we have a unit which we call New Industries, precisely to try and address that. Because you're right, as much as we invest in infrastructure, we have to invest in new industries. Now, as a development finance institution, then we have that ability to take that early risk, which ordinarily would not come naturally from some of the private. You do have venture capitalists which might play some role, but we know their return expectations might also negatively impact on the future sustainability of that. So we play that role. But also then what we find is sometimes particularly when you come in early stage, you might be engaging with people who are technically very strong, but it starts and ends there. And then you need to leverage, which is where then the skills development and the other parts of that come in. So for us, it comes naturally. That's why we have a dedicated unit. We allocate capital, and we can be able to do that. But it also now, because we are able to do that, so that means we have to find financing somewhere else. And where this is where this leveraging comes in, because we don't have unended pots of money. So we have to try and balance that. But also what we do is now, when we take that early risk, there's also an expectation to say what are the additionalities that will come from that. And we know in South Africa the issue of unemployment is high, so we say as we engage and as we encourage these new industries, these new innovations, then to what extent will they contribute directly or indirectly in the creation of new employment?
Indeed. Nena, you can also respond.
Maybe just to add to that, I personally believe that Africa will leapfrog and that it will skip in some places some of the more traditional kind of development models. On the other hand, when I look at manufacturing, only 1% of global manufacturing is happening in Africa, and that cannot be. And I think the way to increase it is actually investing in infrastructure. We need connectivity to markets, we need connectivity to ports, we need ports, we need many other things. So that's why it's such a focus on infrastructure. It's not just because of infrastructure, also to connect the countries in Africa. And you need the broadband as well if you want new technologies to really skyrocket. We need that type of connectivity. So the FIs are still a lot more focused on that backbone, that will bring industries and manufacturing to Africa and some other things. But I do believe that there will be areas where African countries will leapfrog.
Thierry, I also just wanted to get your feedback with regard to Andre's question regarding the use of blended finance in PPPs.
Actually, I only operate in PPP, so where I use blended finance is always, and I do think that the PPP structure is actually very, very good for blended finance, because we're talking about the discipline, and perhaps I should say so before, when you are creating a PPP and you're dealing with project finance, there is enough discipline around, and you can also be a lot more innovative in this instance. So I think this total compatibility between PPP and blended finance is a good match. I just wanted to add something on the I don't think this is exclusive to say that we only invest in infrastructure, and the SME and issue is a big one. But I think around the world, there's probably the longest blended finance experience is in the SME sector, even in the US or in Europe, or when I think about the Juncker plan in Europe, there's a SME window and there's an infrastructure window, which is a guarantee provided by the EU to the EIB, then to over distribution networks. So it will come there. It's quite actually easy to replicate those solutions through securitization, through guarantees, first loss pieces. So there's almost nothing to invent in a way in the blended finance for SME and innovation. It's a question of allocating resources and try to start running as you learn how to walk at the same time. But it will get there almost naturally, I think.
We'll take a second round of questions from the audience. If there are any questions, please raise your hand. The roving mic will make its way to you. Have we gotten shy? Maybe just not yet. Mr. Chocho has a question there. Any other question following that one? There's a hand on that side there. We'll come to you after that, sir.
Thank you, Gugu. Certainly a very informative discussion this morning. I just wanted to pose this simple but probably very controversial question to the representative from the IFC. Do you have any views on using this instrument in interest subsidies for particularly small businesses type finance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, sir. And you'll take note of that question. And you had a question, sir. If you could please stand up and introduce yourself and pose your question.
Yes, I'm Beno Fuga from the Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa. Yes, my question goes to the whole panel because I don't know who will be able to, who specialize in that. It's about, I heard that we talk about projects that are bankable and that are ready for funding. But I didn't hear anything about how we take this project to the level of becoming bankable. What does the blended finance or funders do to make this project reach that level? Because I think that's where we face the problem in most of the projects that come, let's say, to us, that we find that the project is not well structured and it may not be presented to any bank. So what is done at that level? The second question is on what I've observed personally is that some countries have some project just because they see their neighbor doing the same thing. So what is it that you do at that level, at your level, to ensure that the projects are coordinated at different layers or with different countries to avoid duplications or helping a country and saying, raise the flag to say, this is where we raised the fund and this is what we did. And just to find that this could be done at regional level and save more money.
Makes sense. Thank you so much for your question, Mr. Fuga. Nena, let's get your response first to the question that was alluded to by Mr. Njonjo.
Thank you. If I understood correctly, the question is whether IFC would support interest rates subsidy or lower interest rates. From our own account, we will not do this because we take pride of being able to invest over 60 years on market-based terms, and demonstrated that by doing that, private sector came into some of the least developed countries in the world. But the good news is that we can use blended finance instruments, the part that's provided to us by donors, to blend with our own account investments to offer subsidized rates. And again, going back to my principle of minimality, before we offer lower rate for that tranche of the financing, we would look at other options, and we would think of maybe just a subsidized loan with a lesser security or longer tenors would actually make the project bankable. Maybe we don't even need to go to the lower rate. If we have to go with a lower rate, we have instruments that can do that, but that will be for a part of the overall financing, which we call blended instrument.
Perfect. Open question to the panel regarding Ben's question. You want to add?
Taking an example, because I think we sort of missed each other on that. I think blended finance is actually about making things bankable. And in that early stage, it's not only when we say projects that are bankable, I think in principle sort of can run on good revenues. But if I would take the example of most PPAs in most African countries where the public utility is a poor credit, generally, because a lot of them have been poorly run, not everywhere, so nobody takes offense, please. And clearly, I've been discussing with a number of people like the MMC or people like that to see whether their grant can be used as a guarantee fund to actually guarantee some of the obligation of these public utilities. So therefore, the contract, which generally was bankable, where people were very uncomfortable with the counterparty that was across the table as a utility, but that grant can be used, for example, as a guaranteed fund and make the project easier for people to go through. So you're actually making it bankable because it will take forever for people to get into the comfort of a counterparty. You would ask for a Ministry of Finance guarantee, and after 5 guarantees, you probably get there. So this is when a grant, for example, can create a guarantee that is available to actually solve the problem and make the project immediately bankable. And I'm talking from a theoretical perspective there, but this is the kind of things that blended finance on a very simple way could do.
I'd like us also to follow up on the next question, which again alludes to duplication, and perhaps that can also lead us to some of the case studies and examples that you've participated in regarding projects on the continent to ensure that there's no duplication of mistakes, and of course, perhaps, for lack of a better term, copycat syndrome taking place. Patrick, let's start with you. We'll come to Jeffrey and Mamadou.
On that one, I think I would love to use the example of the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, the SDGs, that we are hosting for the continent. Our objective is to make sure that we have access to global best practices and to make sure that we're able to share experiences with our partners across the world, both in terms of the public as well as private sector. Because when you are able to have these experiences, it enriches whatever project you're looking at. Because you might find that somewhere in Canada, Australia, or in China, or in Asia, or somewhere on the continent, we have someone who has undertaken a similar project and had certain experiences. So the viability of projects is very much a function of the skill sets that then will be able actually to crystallize its economics and its risk properly, so that then we are able to deal with it accordingly. And yes, the big issue is that early stage project prep, that risk capital that the private sector is not willing to put in. That's where you start looking at the direction of the DFIs and governments to be able actually to come in for that, so that at least then it gets into a bankable project that it can be attractive to the private sector.
Exactly. Jeffrey, you want to add?
Yes, I think Patrick has touched. I mean, on the project preparation, we are able to use blended finance in that stage, because really, if you invest enough time in ensuring that those projects are prepared well, then their bankability is even enhanced. That's one. But on the issue of your neighbor doing the same thing, I think the issue of evaluating the project robustly in terms of the market acceptance, that should, I know I'm putting it a little bit more simplistic, but that should be the way in which you test that. And for us to ensure that the project is sustainable, I think we have to engage with those, even if it's governments that are in the next door, to say, but your neighbor has that, so why should you think yours will be sustainable in exclusion of the others? And it's those sometimes difficult conversations that needs to be had, so that we ensure that those projects that we back are indeed sustainable to the long term.
Exactly. Mamadou, you wanted to provide feedback as well?
I wasn't sure about
I want to get your commentary and feedback, because in a moment we will start wrapping up. But Nena, you've got feedback with regard to
one reaction to this last question. While obviously the local content matters, we also are looking at the speed of delivering some of the solutions in multiple countries, including obviously in all the countries in Africa. So we're looking at platform approaches, because there is urgency here, and if we always start structuring PPPs or from scratch, I think we will not be able to do it very quickly. So we came up with a platform approach for scaling solar, for example, which has similar approach in terms of advice that we provide to the government on the transaction, some of the processes of how do you do the bidding, etc. And we actually have seen that this sequenced approach has already worked. In one country, in another one, I think close to closing. So, and that brings speed to delivery, even though this is happening in different countries.
Quite a few themes that have certainly come together as we start with our closing comments with regard to the panel discussion, but clearly collaboration has been highlighted, the necessity for the relevant skills, and of course taking a look at the projects that we invest in, being both in the basics of infrastructure as well as new frontiers. I want us to tie it back to the overriding theme of the World Economic Forum on Africa for this year, which is achieving inclusive growth through responsive and responsible leadership. Through blended finance and opportunities that we identify for capital investment in the long term to achieve the SDGs by 2030, how do we ensure that the investments that we make are aligned with our objectives for inclusive growth? I'd like us to get 30 seconds each as we make our way down the panel. Jeffrey, let's start with you.
Well, I would want to refer to an example. When we did blended finance in a renewable space and energy savings for SMEs, for me that was a practical one, where you're providing power through the savings, but knowing that the SMEs do not have access to finance, using the blended finance from the savings that they make from those energy savings, then they're able to save power, but also be able to ensure that their business is sustainable. So here what we are doing is providing energy, bringing in SMEs. So for me, that was a practical example, and I think we can learn from that.
Thierry?
No, we are a 25-year investor, so therefore inclusion with or without blended finance is a must-have for risk mitigation. So we don't necessarily see this as an option. It's a must-have. Because clearly, as I was mentioning earlier, unless you engage with communities and there is a real benefit around the projects that you finance, you really want to be around for 25 years and you want this to be sustainable enough. So I think blended finance actually increases the potential, because of the discipline, because of the various parties around and stakeholders, for more inclusion, but definitely when you invest in infrastructure, inclusion should be your first go.
Exactly. Patrick?
Blended finance is quite a strategic mechanism to really unlock the infrastructure networks on the continent. We are a continent that is trading with itself at currently sitting at about 13%. So if we really want to make sure that the continent begins to play its meaningful role in the global economic space, we need to really ensure that we are able to expand the infrastructure networks and use the blended financing to make sure that we enable trade within the continent, which will create so many jobs for the people of the continent and for the youth of the continent. Innovation becomes extremely important because then you're beginning to bring new industries, new ideas. Internet for all actually is going to be opening up all these kinds of opportunities.
True.
But then the infrastructure wherein we are also promoting women, we're promoting youth-owned businesses, I think will go a long way also in that direction of bringing about an inclusive economic growth for the people of the continent.
True. Mamadou, very briefly.
Well, if we see inclusivity as really providing the opportunities to those who don't have it, to be able to access resources, infrastructure, and others that enables them to participate in the economy, or actually to be able, maybe in the bottom of the pyramid, to access services that they wouldn't otherwise access. I think that in this really innovative finance in general, and in particular, blended finance really bears a huge potential actually to really create and attract actually the investment in those and enabling that, and I think that's really wonderful.
For IFC as a development institution, inclusion and sustainability have to always be present, irrespective of which instruments we use. And I'm with Thierry on blended finance. This gives us a potential to increase the number of bankable deals in Africa and therefore include a lot more people in the economies.
Full participation clearly taking place from not only the various areas where capital is unleashed from, but of course in making sure that nobody gets left behind within the capital that we allocate to several projects across the continent. A big thank you to each and every one of my panelists for participating today. Jeffrey Krina, the Chief Executive Officer and President of the IDC, Thierry Deu, CEO of Meridium Infrastructure, Patrick Dlamini, CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, Mamadou Bete, MD of Rockefeller Foundation Africa, and Nena Stojilkovic of the Vice President and Blended Finance and Partnerships of the IFC. Of course, to our audience as well for staying with us and participating, including the questions that were asked, and you at home for also joining us on conversation in social media too. That's how we wrap up our view and a conversation on blended finance, but this will certainly continue going forward as we look to unlock Sustainable Development Goal objectives for the African continent before the year 2030. From myself, Gugule Tucela, and the team, it's goodbye for now. That's a wrap. Thank you so much to our panelists.